Welcome to the Glassworking shop. Well, I finally have a break from NQALHA production. I can get back in the Glassworking shop and get back to making videos. It's kind of been a long time since I've made one, and they're kind of fun to make. So my latest glass and metal and stone sculpture came out pretty good. Here's a picture of it. I kind of like the overall flavor of the design, so I'm going to make another one. And it won't be exactly the same, but it'll have a lot of the same elements. And I'm going to document pretty much every step in the process in this series of videos. Maybe not every step, because some of it is kind of repetitive and boring, but I'll try to cover most of the points. One thing that I'm starting to do more of now, you know, I'm an engineer, I'm a machinist, and I tend to like planning and precision. I'm starting to plan a little bit more about, instead of just going out in the shop and making something and then seeing how it comes out, trying to actually plan how things are going to go together. And so I started using some CAD models to try to predict in a very limited way how these things are going to come out. Of course, machinist's engineering CAD is a rather poor tool for visualizing the outcome of an artistic piece of glass, especially when the glass is squeezed and it flows around in weird ways. So the CAD model is only of very limited use, but I'm still proceeding down that path because, hey, limited use is better than nothing. So here's the CAD model of the original marine piece, Marini assembly, and it kind of sort of shows how the colors work together and kind of shows a tiny flavor of the geometry, but of course it looks nothing at all like the final result. So, like I said, still barely useful, but not that horribly useful. Here's the CAD drawing of what I'm going to do in this version, and it's a little more elaborate, has a little more detail, has a few different colors, and hopefully, with any luck, it'll come out a little better, because every time I do one of these, it seems like they come out a little better. So, another thing that I've done, since these assemblies are put together out of pieces, sometimes requiring many steps, I'm actually calculating volumes and trying to figure out how many cubic inches of glass do I need in the last step, and then working backward to try to figure out how much prep I need to make, and then account for waste and account for mistakes and account for unusable pieces, and kind of estimate how much prep I need to make before I start making prep. So I have no doubt that this will have problems and that I'll guess wrong and that I'll calculate wrong, but still, step by step, I'm trying to make it a little bit more disciplined, systematic kind of approach with fewer surprises and a slightly greater chance at a positive outcome. So today I'm going to start doing prep. This is fairly uninteresting prep, and I just sometimes wonder about, you know, why do I keep making the same videos over and over again, showing the same uninteresting stuff? And then I look at some of the machining videos that I watch, and there they are doing the exact same thing, putting a piece in a 4-jaw chuck and indicating it in. And I've seen it 1,000 times, and I still watch them. So anyway, if this is your first time watching one of my videos, then it won't be repetitive. And if it's if you've been watching them for a while, I hope you enjoy them. So I'm going to go over and start working on a piece of prep. This will be a very simple white core with a black outside that needs to be pulled down to reasonably small dimension. It'll be pulled down to 0.2 inches. And then after it's cooled and cut up, it will be arranged in a ring around another color core to make a kind of a fancy border for the next little piece of cane that I'm making. So Time to get to work. So I pre-made, gathered up a little bit of glass on the end of some of these, the punties. I've got this stuff pre-made, so it makes it a little easier. Now I'm going to gather up a wad, a cylinder of star white glass. And as I said in the introduction, I'm trying to do this in a little more disciplined, systematic way. And so I'm actually going to be trying to make this core a measured size. And I have my calipers there preset. I'm trying to make this thing 0.8 inches in diameter. And I'm gathering on the NQALHA. Gathering on the NQALHA is one of the operations that works really, really well. And I'm finding that I'm getting better and better results with it the more I practice. So I've got the NQALHA rotating at a reasonably slow speed, and I'm twisting the glass a little bit faster, kind of intentionally introducing a bit of a twist. And there's actually a reason for it. The star white contains a little bit of trapped air that's just part of the manufacturing process. It's kind of like how it comes out. And by twisting the rod as it melts into the gather, I'm seeing some of the trapped air is escaping, and I'm seeing some little bubbles popping. And early on, when I was first learning glasswork, I was kind of surprised to see that if I overheated glass, it would start boiling. And I thought, oh no, I'm boiling my clear, or I'm boiling my white. And then my teacher said, oh no, you're not boiling it, it's just got air in it. So for new glassworkers who are just learning to deal with color, every time you see a bubble, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're boiling. It could just mean that you're releasing trapped air. So what I'm doing here when I'm gathering, I'm heating the rod, primarily putting my heat on the rod that I'm feeding into the gather, trying to keep the gather somewhat cold and somewhat under control, and then just kind of like spinning it and trying to maintain at least somewhat of a consistent diameter, at least somewhat close to the size that I'm shooting for. So what I'm trying to do when I cover this with a single layer of black, I'm trying to get the core to be fairly large by comparison with a fairly thin coating of black. I don't want my black coating to get overly thick, and so I've kind of going on a combination of calculation and experience to tell me that 0.8 inches for the core is a good size. So let's switch into the rod holder here. The glass that I'm melting in, the end of the rod is actually quite liquid, and it's taken a little bit of skill development to figure out how to control it and how to get a somewhat uniform cylinder. My cylinders are definitely getting better. Not perfect yet, but who knows? Maybe there is no such thing as perfect in glass. So, little bit by little bit, keeping it very hot on the rod end and trying to keep it under control, cooler and under control on the area that's finished, because one of the easy things to do when gathering on the NQALHA, if you don't specifically watch out for it and try to keep it under control, the gather will end up getting too large in diameter and too short. So just trying to counteract that tendency and try to produce as close as I can to a uniform cylinder. Of course, I still have lots of opportunity to fix it up as the process continues. So, just about reached the end of my rod holder's ability to do the job. I know some glass workers, one of my teachers typically just tears off the end of the rod because the end of the rod is a little bit crappier glass. It's got, because it's a broken end, it tends to have a little bit of bubbling in it. I'm not that picky, I just melt it in. So now I'm gonna just even out a little bit. And got my caliper over here. So I'm pretty close to hit it perfectly just in the gather. I'm using a kind of a dumb, let me get it in the camera, kind of a dumb metal caliper. I don't use my nice quality machinist calipers in the glassworking shop because, you know, it's a difficult environment out here in the hot shop, and the plain old school dumb metal, no electronics, nothing sensitive, is probably much more suitable for working around hot glass, and it does the job just fine. I'm nowhere near holding thousandths in my glass work, although I always try to imagine, how could that be possible? Could it be possible to hold metalworking tolerances in glass? I don't know. So now I'm switching to handwork. And that's one of the points that I make when discussing the NQALHA, is that, like, it's in the name, it's an assistant. And the intention of the use of the tool is that you go back and forth. Use handwork when handwork makes sense. Use the NQALHA when the NQALHA makes sense. And for the kind of the final touch-up, especially when the piece starts getting loose and floppy and unsupported, I find that I can control a piece of glass, hot, sloppy glass, quite a lot better by hand than I can with the NQALHA. So that, oh, it's just like almost perfect. So, gonna put this into the NQALHA, rotate into striping position and prepare for striping. So I'm going to let it cool for a couple of minutes, and while it's cooling, I'll just mention my tool rack setup, where I've seen some glass workers that have an incredibly messy bench. I call it a horizontal trash can, just completely covered with tools and scraps and crap and who knows what else. I like a clean bench, and so I've got a steel rack with stainless shelves, and all the tools go on the rack until they're needed. Then I use them and put them back. I do leave maybe one or two tools on the bench, the ones that I'm using really frequently, but mostly I like a really clean bench. So, going to be striping with the hand torch here, already pre-adjusted. I'm going to flip the NQALHA into positioning mode. And of course, in positioning mode, when the foot pedal is not pressed, there is no rotation, and then every time the foot pedal is pressed, it rotates a bit. So, just a couple of words about why did I take that time and wait before I started striping. Because if the core has to be hot enough that the glass will stick. Glass won't stick to a cold core, but if the core is too hot and too soft, and I maybe get a little too aggressive with my striping and don't let the striping rods get hot enough, it'll press divots into the final piece, and I want a nice clean design, so I'm letting the core cool down and then making sure that the striping rod is nice and soft before applying, and then not pressing too hard. I'm mostly applying heat to the striping rod, and a little bit of the spill from the side of the torch flame is going on the substrate and on the neighboring stripe that I just put down to kind of help keep the stripes all stuck together. But the vast majority of the heat is applied to the striping rod. And yes, I know I'm being a little sloppy about my ends and getting slightly ratty looking little nubbins. Doesn't matter in this operation, it doesn't cause a problem. And maybe someday I'll learn to stripe better. But I'm striping with the hand torch and the color rod because it just feels more natural to me. It feels more intuitive to have the work held in a work holding situation and be able to have both hands free for the work I'm doing. And this is something that one of the design goals for the NQALHA was to be a work holding device that allows both hands to be free. I realize that most marine makers hold the workpiece in their hand and stripe on a bench torch, and they claim that it feels more natural and comfortable to them, and hey, I'm not going to argue with that. Whatever feels comfortable for you is what you should do. But for me, I'm a welder. It feels like welding. And I encourage all NQALHA users to try this method at least once. See if you like it. So, just trying to lay down the most uniform stripe that I can do, as carefully as I can do it. I'm going to run out of rod there. I'm using the Mirage hand torch with a fairly small oxidizing Mirage flame, so I get a large area of flame to preheat the rod, but the flame isn't ripping hot, so I avoid overheating the color, which isn't as important with jet black, but very important with some of the more sensitive colors to avoid overheating them. I'm just kind of going around and knocking off a few of those little nubbins. Now back to rotation mode. into position. So I'm just once again using a fairly small, fairly oxidizing, fairly cold flame, just really slowly letting the uneven surface kind of melt together. I think one of the nice things about the NQALHA, it makes it easier to work slowly, at least it does for me, because when I'm working by hand, I feel a tendency to rush because my hand is getting tired and I'm getting bored and I'm in a hurry, and maybe it's just my problem, maybe it's nothing inherent in the work, but I find it easier to work slowly and gently heat glass without overheating it when the NQALHA is doing the rotation and I'm just a spectator. So I started at the punty end because that's the area where if it's going to crack, that's the area where I'm going to have trouble, because it's a cold end and the end of the stripes often has acute angles in it, so it's kind of important to avoid cracking at the punty end. So when I get done striping, I like to hit that end first. Of course, that's also the unstable end, and if I get that end too hot, then the piece will droop and get out of control. So I kind of make sure that end is hot and happy, and more or less started the melting in process. Then I move to the far end where there's kind of no danger of collapse, and start the smoothing process. Now, every time I hit it with the paddle, it's losing heat, and so you can't just kind of hold the paddle on it and paste it in place and just hold it there, or your glass will never get hot. So it's a balance between letting the torch get the glass to working temperature, then applying just a little bit of paddle pressure to kind of squish it down a little bit, and then get the paddle out of there and resist the temptation to constantly be working. Another thing that I've started doing recently, when I started doing this on the NQALHA, I would hold the paddle like this for doing the smoothing, and that puts the paddle directly in the torch flame. Then I went to a lesson where I was watching a glassworker show how he does it, and he showed me the underhanded technique where you're applying the paddle from the bottom of the glass and keeping it out of the torch flame, and this seems to make so much sense. So now I'm going to reverse direction. I was getting a little bit of twist, and even though the thing that I'm making is just a solid core with a skin on it, where twist really doesn't matter at all, it still is a good habit to get into, just to practice keeping things straight. And while I'm talking here, I got a little off center. It's good practice just to practice keeping things, to practice keeping twist under control, so when a piece actually needs to be straight, I've got the skill developed and practiced. So just slowly, a little bit at a time. So this will, once the outer layers of the rods have all been melted together, and of course I realize that the better the striping is done, the less melting is required to kind of fix the problems that were introduced by the striping. So once the stripes are all melted in, then I can punty up to the other end and pull this thing down into a small rod. So gotta remember to keep my punty end hot. Don't want it getting out of control, causing me problems. So let me switch back to handwork. Turn up the fire a little bit. I typically like to work with relatively short pieces. I know that I've taken classes in marine making where the instructor said that your workpiece, unsupported workpiece, would ideally be 2 inches long. I typically work somewhere between 2 and 3 inches. I've found that I'm able to control a single-sided 3-inch piece well enough to get a decent result, but a 2-inch piece is definitely easier to control. This one's looking like I've got maybe a little over 2 inches of usable material. I did stripe a little bit beyond the core that I want to keep. I did get a little bit of the stripe onto the moil at the end of the punty, and this is intentional. I think it helps me get a little bit better yield of good material by using longer moils and longer punties. So that guy looks ready to go. I got a tiny little bit of droop, stop the NQALHA, let gravity and maybe a little bit of pressure have a little bit of an effect here. Then I'm going to take my puller out of the kiln. I've already kind of gathered up some glass on the end here. And while I'm heating my puller, I don't want to neglect the moil and punty on the piece, because when this is ready to pull, I want uniform heat. And as I'm attaching the puller, I'm going to be heating the far end, and that means the punty end is getting cold. The whole key to a good pull is uniform heat. I'm angling the rod a little bit to try to coerce that end to fully stick. So I get a nice, fully bonded puller end here. I'm taking it over to the Almarver and straightening it all out. So the trick now, before pulling this down, is to get the entire thing heated uniformly. Now the problem with that is that both of the ends that are attached to the pullers are acting as heat sinks. They're sucking the heat out of the glass. And if you a very common beginner problem that I've had many times If you think you're heating a piece like this uniformly, your middle is too hot, your ends are too cold. And when you go to pull it, you'll end up with a strand of spaghetti and two giant knuckles. The knuckle is the term that we use for the cone-shaped residue at either end of the pull. And we try to minimize the knuckle. I have never yet been able to do one that's completely knuckle-free, but you always try to minimize it a little bit. I'm going to turn up the fire just a touch. So in order to minimize the knuckle, I'm doing two things. I've got very large moils on either end of my punties, and I'm also preferentially heating, putting more heat at the ends, going back and forth heating the ends, realizing that the middle will probably take care of itself. The other thing that I'm doing is being aware that glass is an insulator, and even though it's starting to feel a little loose, one of the things that one of my early teachers taught me, when you think it's ready, it's probably only about halfway there, if that. So I'm being kind of extra careful here to make sure that I've got heat soaked all the way into the core of this thing. Even though it's feeling loose, the core probably isn't ready yet. So preferentially heating the ends, trying to keep it under control because it is getting very loose. Taking my time, not getting ahead of myself. Looking at the color. Feeling how it feels. It's starting to seriously droop. It's getting very, very soft now. Okay, take it out of the flame, let it stabilize and equalize for a moment, and start very slowly pulling, speeding up a little bit, and then once I get near my target diameter, kind of blow on it a little bit in the middle to kind of like set the shape, and then give it a nice strong pull, a mighty pull indeed. And that is a reasonably straight, reasonably uniform pull that is very close to what I want. So I'm going to cut off the center section. Get one knuckle in the flame so it doesn't crack. Put the other knuckle in the kiln. Now, because this piece that I've made is so small, I've been told that it doesn't really need annealing. I'm just going to put it into a fiber blanket and let it air cool. Obviously, thicker pieces, elaborate Marini assemblies, definitely require careful annealing and a proper annealing cycle. But for a 5 millimeter or so diameter rod, I think I can get away with air cooling. And I've actually been told by a teacher, a very, very experienced Marini maker, that minimizing the amount of time the glass is hot is a fairly important thing to do, and it's actually better for the final result to do air cooling if you can get away with it. Basically, don't do a full annealing cycle unless you need one. So now, I'm just going to attempt to rework as much of this knuckle as I can. This is the bad end where the stripes extend beyond the core, so there's no reason to try to get it. You try to get it all the way to the end of the color because the end isn't that good. But I think I can get a little bit of usable material out of this. Now what I'm doing here, it's super easy to overheat. When the glass gets thin like this, it's super easy to overheat it and overpull it because I'm trying to get it uniform, but the typical thing that happens when you're trying to get it uniform is you end up getting it way too thin. So I'm just being very careful with my heating. Heating it up just barely enough that I can stretch it. And so there I've got, not perfect, but it'll probably be usable. We've got a fairly usable little piece. And since my target is to make 3-inch pieces, this is probably just about perfect. Cut that little guy off. And into the fiber blanket. Come on, get in there. Okay. And try to see what I can get out of this piece. This one is a better piece. This is the better end, and so I have more usable glass to get out of it. Putting the tools in the tool rack. Get a little preheat into the moil end. Okay, it doesn't need to be perfectly on center because I'm going to be heating it up a lot, but it's nice to have it kind of sort of on center. I've been thinking about trying to develop a technique of marine pull on the NQALHA. I've made some very preliminary attempts with very mixed results. So I'll probably continue the development, but for today I just need to make some material, so I'm going to go with what I know. Just about everything in glasswork is nonlinear, and that means that for those who don't have an engineering or a scientific background, means that things behave differently than you might expect. Cold glass is an insulator. Heat moves very slowly and poorly through cold glass, but when glass gets hot, heat flows a little bit better. Its conductivity improves. And this can result for the inexperienced glassworker that you're heating, thinking, is this thing ever going to get hot? Is this thing ever going to get hot? Is this thing ever going to, oops, it's overheated. Another thing that is somewhat nonlinear is pulling behavior. That it seems like glass wants to pull into a hair, into a tiny, tiny, tiny little stringer, and trying to control your thickness and keep your pull a uniform diameter, exceptionally difficult to do. And I definitely haven't mastered it. I'm still struggling with it, but it is a very difficult thing to control, pulling to a uniform, constant diameter that isn't hair thin. Now, of course, since the component that I'm making is going to go through a whole lot more work, a tiny little bit of lumpiness at this stage doesn't really affect the final outcome, although I still try every time I do it to make them as straight as I can make them. And I'm sure that people with better skill would be watching me and going, dude, that's not very good, it's all lumpy. So I think I'm going to call that close enough. It will accomplish the task that I have for it. Whoop. That guy cleaned itself for me. So I can reuse that punty for my next pull. So that does it for today's glasswork. And next step is going to be to put a ring of these little rods around another core and then pull that down, and then that cane will be used to fill grooves that are pressed into a cylinder that I'm going to make using the squeezer. So I know this one hasn't been that super interesting, but a large variety of people are out there that some are glassworking experts who would find this rather boring and probably criticize my work, and less experienced glassworkers and people from the general public who have never seen it before. And so I hope I hope somebody was at least a little bit entertained, and maybe if I'm lucky, maybe somebody learned a little bit. So thank you for watching. It's been fun.